In order to resolve a political conflict in the Jackson administration, Martin Van Buren offered his resignation as Secretary of State in 1831. He was then nominated to become ambassador to Great Britain, but the appointment was also blocked in the Senate by his political rival, John Calhoun. Because of these setbacks, Calhoun and many others believed that Van Buren's career was over. However, just 5 years later, he became President of the United States. Van Buren was born on the 5th of December 1782 in Kinderhook in upstate New York. Kinderhook is located just a few miles south of Albany, the state capital. Van Buren's father, Abraham, had fought in the Revolutionary War and later set up a tavern in Kinderhook. Alexander Hamilton and other politicians sometimes dropped into the tavern on their way between Albany and New York City. The Van Buren family were of Dutch origin and Martin's first language was Dutch. He learned English as a child. Later, as a teenager, he studied law and qualified as a lawyer at the age of 21. In 1807, he married Hannah Hose. They had 5 children. Life was much different then, and the population of New York was just about 60,000. Kinderhook was just a small village 150 miles in upstate New York. In 1803, the Van Buren set up a law practice with a partner in Kinderhook. He also became involved in the Democratic Republican Party as an organizer in upstate New York. By 1807, he had become allied to the DeWitt Clinton faction of the party. However, he later split from this faction and became leader of his own faction known as the Bucktails. During his 20s, he built up a strong reputation as a successful lawyer and political activist. He also developed important political alliances, and by 1812 he had won a seat in New York Senate at the age of 30. When the 1812 war broke out with Britain, Van Buren became an organizer of the local New York Militia. By 1815, he had also become Attorney General of New York State. In 1816, he won re-election to the New York Senate and moved residence to the state capital, Albany. During the Revolutionary War, actually, the leaders of the Revolutionary War made Albany the state capital because it was more difficult to reach than New York City for the British Army. In Albany, Van Buren built a famous political machine known as the Albany Regency within the Democratic Party. Its main function, of course, was to promote Van Buren himself as a candidate. It had extensive contacts with newspapers, with unions, and with farm organizations. It was very similar to the famous Tammany Hall political machine in New York City. Actually, the two organizations controlled jobs and patronage and contracts in the state of New York, and they sometimes worked together on intercity projects, and Van Buren developed a high level of skill in negotiating these contracts between these political organizations. In 1821, New York legislature elected him to the United States Senate. At the age of 39, therefore, his national career had really begun. 3 years later, Van Buren supported William Crawford in the presidential election. However, Quincy Adams became president through a deal with Henry Clay. Van Buren became an important member in the Senate. In the late 1820s, he served on both the Judicial and Finance Committee in the United States Senate. He became a strong northern critic of the Quincy Adams administration. Throughout this period, he opposed many of the Federalist policies of the Adams presidency. Gradually, he became a somewhat reluctant supporter of Andrew Jackson, who had won the highest vote in the 1824 election and was a real popular hero from the New Orleans victory in 1815. In regard to foreign policy, however, Van Buren was opposed to the United States participating in the Congress of Panama in 1826. This Congress hoped to organize Latin American colonies against Spain in the same way that the 13 colonies had organized against Britain. However, the leaders of the individual states in Latin America valued their separate sovereignty so highly that the concept of a federation between them collapsed. Prior to the 1828 election, Van Buren reluctantly brought his powerful political machine behind Andrew Jackson. He was not sure exactly where Jackson stood in relation to some issues, as Jackson was deliberately vague. Jackson believed in strong central government, but he also wanted to protect his popular image as a states' right Democrat. In 1828, the governor of New York, DeWitt Clinton, suddenly died, and Van Buren ran to replace him. He won with a massive majority of over 30,000 votes. Andrew Jackson, running for president, also won the state of New York with 5,000 votes, and this was very much with the help of Van Buren's political machine. In the previous 2 years, Van Buren had been a powerful voice in the Senate, critical of Adams and seen by many as the strongest northern supporter of the newly emerging Democratic Party of Andrew Jackson. After just a month as governor of New York, Van Buren was offered and became the Secretary of State. Early on in the Jackson presidency, the Petticoat affair erupted. This affair involved Florette Calhoun. She's the wife of President John Calhoun, and she organised a boycott on cabinet members' wives in relation to Mrs. John Eaton, whose past was somewhat questionable. She was the wife of John Eaton, the Secretary of War. Both Cabinet and Congress were split on this issue, as there was considerable pressure on Jackson, actually, to sack his War Secretary, John Eaton. The scandal rumbled on throughout 1830, and eventually in 1831, Martin Van Buren suggested that the best way to resolve the issue was for the entire Cabinet, himself included, to resign and allow the President to reappoint whoever he wished. Van Buren himself was nominated to become ambassador to Britain, but this nomination was blocked in the Senate due mainly to the influence and the casting vote, actually, of the Vice President, John Calhoun. However, the following year, in May 1832, the Democratic National Convention nominated Van Buren to be Jackson's running mate later that year. Henry Clay opposed Jackson and Van Buren in the election, making the rechartering of the bank the main issue. However, Jackson won the election by vetoing the rechartering of the bank and claiming the bank was totally corrupt and only promoting the interests of the wealthy elite. John Calhoun was also in conflict with the President in relation to the issue of tariffs. Southern planters, depending on the world market for their export of cotton, were opposed to high tariffs. Calhoun, from the state of South Carolina, sought to represent these interests. He wrote a secret political disposition suggesting that South Carolina would nullify any federal law regard it as unconstitutional. He also insisted on a state's right to leave the Union if its interests were threatened by the federal government. Jackson was strongly opposed to such ideas. Calhoun resigned as vice president and became senator for South Carolina in 1832. Jackson's refusal to recharter the bank led to a financial crisis in the second term of his presidency. He ordered the deposits of major East Coast banks to be transferred to the smaller states. However, this led to inflation and chaos within the financial markets. Jackson responded in 1836 by issuing a specie circular, which meant land could only be bought for gold or silver, could not be bought for paper money. As vice president, Van Buren won the nomination for the presidency in mid-1836. The election of 36 was a contest mainly between Van Buren and General William Harrison of the Whig Party. Despite multiple candidates, Van Buren won a majority of the Electoral College votes. He won a majority of the popular vote also in both the North and the South. Van Buren became president in March 1837 and was confronted with an economic crisis just 2 months later. On the 10th of May, banks in New York refused to convert paper money into gold and silver. Other banks soon followed suit. This crisis within the financial system soon led to a crisis within the real economy. Banks closed, businesses went bankrupt, unemployment soared, and a depression and the economy occurred due to the collapse of the banking system. This is known as the Panic of 37. Many believe the cause of the crisis was Andrew Jackson's policy known as the Specious Circular of the previous year, where he attempted to control the expansion of the money supply by making it illegal to buy land with paper money. He also closed the National Bank and transferred government funds to state banks. By the middle of 1837, Whig politicians were demanding that the Jackson Circular be rescinded. However, Van Buren ignored such pleas and instead attempted to establish an independent treasury. However, this solution was blocked by Congress until June 1840. By then, the damage as far as Van Buren's reputation was concerned was already done. The economic crisis was probably the main factor in his loss in the election in November 1840. Martin Van Buren also continued to implement Andrew Jackson's policies in relation to Native Americans. The president agreed 19 separate treaties with the Indians. However, there was disagreement within the tribes in regard to what was agreed and who had rights to sell land to the central government. This led to conflicts between the tribes. Many refused to move. This is known as the conflict. These conflicts are known as the Second Seminole War, and they took place between 1837 and the early 40s. This contributed also to the financial problems of the Van Buren administration. Ultimately, 45,000 Native Americans were forced to move west of the Mississippi. Some estimates say that about a quarter of these people lost their lives in the process. This is known to history as the Trail of Tears and is one of the saddest chapters of American history. There was also conflict in the border region with British North America, now known as Canada. Although the Treaty of 1818 had settled many of the border issues in the broad sense of the word, nonetheless there was disputed areas among the locals in the region. Andrew Jackson had also agreed a boundary in the Maine, New Brunswick region, but the state of Maine was not happy with the settlement. Van Buren sent General Winfield Scott to the border region to settle these disputes. Van Buren also met with the British Foreign Minister, and both sides agreed to resolve the issue by arbitration, which was eventually resolved in the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842. However, Van Buren's diplomatic approach was not really appreciated by voters who wanted a more aggressive style, and this was represented by the William Harrison record as a war hero, and he was an attractive character in the 1840 election. In regard to Texas, throughout the Van Buren presidency, there was a demand from Southern Democrats to annex Texas and thereby enhance the slave power within Congress. Texas had just won its independence from Mexico in 1936 and was recognized by Jackson in the final weeks of his presidency. By 1837, the new Texas administration sent a delegation to Washington to negotiate terms for the new state to become a member of the United States. However, Van Buren rejected such proposals, fearing that acceptance of Texas could lead to war with Mexico, which had never really recognized the independence of Texas as its state. Van Buren also correctly realized that such a war would not have northern support and could actually lead to civil war within the United States. No new states joined the Union during Van Buren's presidency in the late 30s. The population of America at that time was 17 million at the end of his presidency in 41. In the election of 1840, the Whigs were put forward William Harrison. They copied the Democrats and they involved themselves in a lot of clever campaigning techniques. Their slogan, Tippin' and Tyler too, was meant to be both vague and heroic. Ultimately, however, it was Van Buren's failure to solve the economic problems which mainly led to his failure to be re-elected. As an ex-president, he stayed in contact with major figures like Andrew Jackson, but failed to win the Democratic nomination in 1844, mainly because he rejected the annexation of Texas, fearing that it could lead to huge trouble in the future. By the late 1840s, the Free Soil Party, an anti-slavery movement, nominated Van Buren as their candidate. However, he only won 10% of the vote and won no states. He lived until 1862, and in the Mexican War of the late 40s and the beginning of the Civil War, he witnessed his greatest fears come true. Van Buren is not considered one of America's great presidents, but he did make a massive contribution to the early development of the Democratic Party. His ideas, too, in regard to the independent treasury were also borne out in 1846, which lasted until the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. Van Buren's preference for diplomacy over war in resolving conflict is also an important lesson in American history.